It is my great joy to welcome Reverend Paul Johnson, who will be speaking to us today about Passover, a celebration of freedom. Reverend Johnson.
Well, thank you, Beth. The exodus of the Hebrew people from Egypt is a basic archetype or paradigm of Western political thought and culture. I think particularly in our country of our pilgrim forebears that established a new Israel on this continent. I think of the movement for abolition of slavery, where the Exodus served as a real impetus and model. Through the Seder, with its rituals, its readings, symbols, songs, discussions, and games, the release from slavery to freedom is reenacted again and again and again. It is actually a celebration of freedom, which we note today. Now, what is freedom? I think at its most elemental sense, it gives a person a sense that one is not being coerced by another person or by a compulsion within oneself. Now, there are limits, of course, to freedom. I grew up with the statement, "My freedom ends where your nose begins," that it has to be consonant with the limits of another person's desires to experience the same sense of freedom. But Western history is a record of the growth of freedom. Freedom meant the ability to wrest from the soil more than a meager existence. Freedom meant banding together as individuals to form clans or tribes to give the individual a sense of some collective security. And then, of course, we hallow the development of political freedoms, where a society is believed fares best when all are free to participate in deciding the direction of that society. Then we hallow as well our civil, political liberties, freedom of religion and press and assembly, the right to petition the government, the right against forced confession and unjust imprisonment. We think of educational freedom, which frees people from bondage to ignorance and superstition. And so I could go on and plot the many ways that we have been blessed by this virtue of freedom. And of course, you realize that freedom isn't assured, that it can be constantly under attack. I think currently of the move to restrict voting rights and women's reproductive rights that we have to really be on our guard against and work for in a political sense as well. But of course, I speak this morning not only of political freedoms, but personal freedoms as well. Freedom from addictions, freedom from the constraints of a narrow or dogmatic religious faith. Now, one aspect of the Seder, which has always appealed to me and interested me, is where you're asked to take a piece of matzah and put horseradish on it. And I've always eaten it. Now, I notice not everyone on the table has eaten it, but I'll eat it as a representative of the bitterness of slavery. And sometime in our celebration of freedom, it's helpful to remember bitterness we may have experienced ourselves from lack of freedom in the past, or from what other people have shared with us about their bitterness. But as I think of my bitterness, I was so bitter in my latter years in high school growing up about the strictness of my parents. You can't dance. So other kids in PE class were dancing. I had to have a religious excuse and sit up in the balcony. I wanted to be with the rest of those kids, but I couldn't because it was against my religion. I couldn't see movies. And friends would tell me about these movies and I wanted to go, but I couldn't go. I had to go to 6 different religious services or activities every week without fail, unless I was providentially hindered by illness. And when I got off to college and was on my own, hooray! I'm free! And I went and saw the first movie I ever saw, The Great Escape, starring Steve McQueen. And what a wonderful freedom that was. Or I think of the bitterness of someone else. When I was a graduate school at the University of Minnesota, I worked part-time as a counselor at a institution for adjudicated juvenile delinquents. And they had built these wonderful cottages for the boys, 14 to 16. And one night, I noticed that there was sobbing coming from one of the rooms. And so I went over and talked with this young boy. I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "How would you feel if you were in prison?" As he continued to sob. And you know, that struck a chord deep within me. I would feel pretty bitter if I was in prison. And at that point, as I think back at it, I'm very, 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 very thankful that I'm not in prison, that my freedom is not impeded in that way. So this day, let us be uplifted and thankful over the degree of freedom that we have. And secondly, this morning, I want us to realize that freedom from bondage without a commitment to freedom for something leads to boredom. The question should always be, what is my freedom for? I believe a good answer is this: in order to exercise our personally determined loyalties, that is the purpose of our freedom. I remember a number of years ago hearing a talk by my fellow UU clergyman, Terry Sweetser, who said when the Israelites were out in the desert after escaping from Egypt, well, Moses was up getting the Ten Commandments, they got bored. They needed a golden calf to dance around. And of course, Moses wasn't happy when he found out what they were doing. But when he brought them their law, they were given their own way of life in economics and politics and family life. Freedom from Egypt for their new found life. Now, I have made choices in my life which restrict my freedom. Freedom from, freedom for. The decision to marry and to have children. That restricts your freedom, right? But it's for a greater good. Now, when in my single life, I was guided by the maxim of never procure anything that you have to paint or feed. By gosh and by golly, my wife and I bought a house. We had 2 children. We even got a dog. We decided to divest ourselves consciously and willingly of one sort of freedom for another freedom, right? So freedom is a core value of Unitarian Universalism. It's even in the bylaws of our association. Nothing herein shall be deemed to infringe on individual freedom of belief, which is inherent in the Unitarian Universalist heritage. Each congregation has control of its own affairs. It calls and ordains its own ministers. It is really an association of independent congregations, which our congregations raise their own funds, develop their own forms of worship, relate as they will to their local communities. We don't have a specific creed. We have general principles, but not a specific creed, which everyone must subscribe to. But with all this freedom, it's important to say that freedom from is insufficient in religion. Our freedom of religion has the specific value of providing a climate in which we can exercise our loyalties in good conscience. Freedom of conscience or belief is not to believe the possibility of believing anything and everything. And I've heard this from time to time over the years. Maybe you have too. As a you can believe anything you want to believe. Well, I've tried to believe a number of things, and I'm a billionaire. But no. It's to provide for ourselves the most intelligent, profound, inclusive, and emotionally satisfying religious position that we are capable of creating, one with consistent moral consequences in our lives. And we can expect within our congregations that no one will harass us or coerce us to another point of view. That our differences will be accepted as our privilege, and that others will generously attempt to understand us. Now, sometimes this requires agreeing to disagree agreeably, but we come here because we appreciate the open sharing and the contest of differing viewpoints, because we believe that the dialogue of mind with mind informs loyalties and commitments in a positive way. So a freedom from is order to have a freedom for. A third issue is that freedom is a developing process. It's not a possession you hold in your hand once and for all. It involves daily choices, which may invoke anxiety. Let's face it, we may be forced in some ways to please a boss, to avoid being fired. How far do we go in doing that? We may have to struggle with compromising our spiritual and essential values in the pursuit of success. I'm much taken with a quote from Alexis de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who visited this country in the 19th century. And very interesting, he wrote this: "I know of no country where there is still so little independence of mind and real freedom of discussion as in America. You are free to think differently from me and to retain your life, your property, and all that you possess, but you are henceforth a stranger among your people. You will retain your civil rights, but they will be useless to you. Other people will affect to scorn you. I saw the effect of scorn of public opinion upon individual belief and independence." Alexis, what are you talking about? I said when I first read that. But you know, there's some truth to that, isn't there? That within a context of a social community, if we stand up for our particular beliefs or our values, we may be scorned by other people. We may be ostracized. What do? That's a dilemma, isn't it? Of anxiety with freedom. I'm not giving you pat answers here, but I want to suggest some strategies that I've learned from others who are my heroes. You may have your heroes of freedom, but two of mine are Helen and Scott Nearing. Now, Helen Nearing was originally from our congregation in Ridgewood, New Jersey, and she married Scott way back in the 1920s. Many years ago, I read two of their books, Living the Good Life and Continuing the Good Life, about their homesteading in Vermont and Maine. And then a number of years later, I read Helen's book about her husband Scott's death at over the age of 100. But they were absolute pacifists and vegetarians. They evaded paying income tax for support of war by the simple process of not earning enough money to pay any taxes. They wanted their life to be as free as possible. And they simplified meal preparation so that it would take less time to prepare a meal than to eat it. Isn't that interesting? And they avoided as much as possible the market economy, where it would restrict their freedom. They said, we're only going to give 4 hours every day for sustenance to meet our needs. They call that their bread work. And the rest of the time in their life was giving over to playing musical instruments, to reading, to writing, to visiting, to enjoying nature. Individually and together, they wrote many books about maple sugaring, homesteading, and political economics. Now, they were examples of living freely in terms of their values. And I valued that, and they are heroes for mine. Not that I can follow them all the way, but they encourage me to stand up for myself. Another hero is Anatoly Sharansky. Remember him? A number of years ago, he was a Soviet dissident, and they put him away in prison for 9 years because of what he had said about the government. But he finally was released. And even at the point of release, he was brought to the point where he had to assert his freedom again. He was really brought to a bridge in Berlin, and once he got over that bridge, he'd be free. But the Soviet guards with him said, "You've got to give us your prayer book. You can't take that with you, your psalm book." That psalm book had given him spiritual sustenance during his imprisonment. And he refused to hand over his psalm book. And he clutched it and went down into the snow. Can you imagine that? That close to freedom. And he was not going to abrogate his personal freedom. He risked that for a psalm book, and they let him have it. Can you think of the adverse publicity if they had brought him all that way close and then had him reneged? But courage and fortitude of these folks is instructive to me as I attempt to be more free in my life, which is a continuing process. Freedom from addictions and compulsions, perhaps. Freedom from an overweening, unrealistic sense of responsibility, perhaps. Freedom from inferiority or a lack of self-confidence. And finally, financial freedom. Fourth, I would say, it's important to use our freedom to help others gain their freedom. Yesterday, in our Building Your Own Theology class, we looked at one point, at Maimonides' ladder of charity, of increasingly valuable and important aspects of charity, or living for others. And at the top of the ladder is the ability of enabling the poor to have a skill or a business to enable them to be self-sufficient and to do that anonymously. He said that is at the very top of charity and serving. And there's something to that, isn't it? And I'm pleased when congregations do that. I think of my congregation in Princeton, where we joined the organization One Church, One Family, where we were going to help one family get back on its feet. This family, the wife, tried to earn money by being a home health aide. She had training in that area. Her husband was disabled and in a wheelchair. Their son had gotten into trouble with the law and was in the process of making restitution to pay back for his malfeasance. They were in a real fix. And the husband couldn't get out of the home because there wasn't a ramp so he could get down the steps. And our congregation took on that family. We helped them get an automobile so the wife could get to her work as a home health aide. We helped build a ramp so the husband would have the freedom to leave the house. And we gave the son yard jobs so he could get money so he could pay what he owed for restitution. The head of our care committee got her dentist to offer free dental work to the wife who had so many dental problems. And I drove her to the dentist. But that family eventually was helped to get back on its feet and eventually got a home from Habitat for Humanity. Now, isn't that a wonderful thing to grant that degree of freedom? When I was at the Treasure Coast congregation at Stewart for 4 years, every year at Christmas time, they would take 2 offerings, the Sunday before Christmas and Christmas Eve, and give to a local charity. And one year I said, let's help out students at our community college. I had read an article that so many of them had to drop out because they couldn't afford the tuition, which is $3,000 a year. And so we made that our goal one year. And we raised, well, a bit over $1,000 to help a student out. Because that is the way in our society that so many people, disadvantaged, can get a leg up, the community colleges. I think helping others to become free is an important thing. And then Friday, as I was working on the sermon, I came across another one that I wanted to share with you. To remind ourselves again and again that the future is not determined. So people say, well, that's the way things are. That's the way I am. And of course, various things have fit into that idea of determinism, scientific determinism, that everything's determined, the nature of things. We're not really free, autonomous beings. Of course, that was Newtonian physics too, but Alfred North Whitehead took the indeterminacy of physics and brought it into the human sphere and said, well, as subatomic entities don't have freedom, and there's randomness there, we have freedom as well. And there's a lure within the nature of things to greater meaning and greater harmony if we will respond to it. He called that God. And I really think there's something to that. And of course, behavioral psychology says we're not free. We are a product of our contingencies, positive and negative reinforcement, and you never can get out of that. I remember hearing a lecture by a behavioral psychologist one time, and I said, well, isn't it possible that we can determine our own contingencies, our own positive or negative reinforcement? And I gave an example of a friend of mine who loved to ski. This is when I worked at University of Minnesota, Duluth. And of course, if you live in Duluth, you have so many opportunities in the wintertime for skiing. But then summer came, and he was bored. So what was he going to do? He would go up to British Columbia to ski. But he said to himself, this is so expensive. Can I find a way to enjoy my summers here in Duluth? And he said, how about tennis? So he set up a whole positive reinforcement scheme of playing tennis with people he enjoyed, of going to a special place to enjoy food and drink after playing tennis. He set up all these positive contingencies till he finally started to enjoy tennis. So I said to this professor who was lecturing, I said, well, was he free to establish his own contingencies, his own positive reinforcements, and thus change his behavior and attitudes? And he stepped back and he said, oh, I would begin to wonder what in his background led him to make that choice. I couldn't convince him otherwise. But I, along with William James, said my first act of free will is to believe in free will. It has positive effects. So today we celebrate freedom, not only as persons who are free, but as those who are becoming free. We recognize that the anxieties involved in practicing it, and hopefully we gain further courage and insight and strategies from those who have exercised freedom. Our religious freedom is important to us within the context of community, to expression of our loyalties and responsibilities. Now I want to close with a wonderful reading by the noted author, Rabbi Philip Bentley, about Passover and freedom. He said, Jews, for many generations, from many lands, and under all sorts of circumstances, have celebrated liberation at the Passover Seder. Those living under the most horrible persecutions celebrate the freedom that is theirs because they serve God and not any human power, first of all. Those living in more comfortable circumstances, even in lands of political liberty, say, now we are slaves, remembering not only that they were once indeed slaves, but that they share something with all the enslaved of the world. All of us are slaves and need to free ourselves, and no matter what is imposed on us, all of us are free. So I leave you with that puzzling paradox, but I think with great truth. So may it be. Amen.